morning, everybody who's found it here to the stage at Sverigevärlden in Almedalen, and everybody who's watching online today or later. Welcome to the seminar, Global Solidarity Beyond Aid. My name is Gunnel Axelsson Nykander. I'm working as a policy advisor at ACT Church of Sweden, who's hosting this seminar. And welcome first to our first speaker, Anton O'Field-Kerr. Also to, you can see here the other speakers who will come up on stage later, Ulrika Modeer, Joar Forsell, and Erik Lusén. I'll introduce you more later. In Sweden, we have a fierce debate right now on development cooperation, and you will hear more about that later this afternoon. The background is that the government has made deep cuts in the aid budget for 2022 in order to finance reception of refugees expected from Ukraine. And many are upset about that, especially since the budget cut was made in the midst of multiple global crises. And as we approach national elections in September, there are two parties who propose to deep and permanent cuts in the aid budget to abandon Sweden's long-standing commitment for 1% in foreign aid. So there is definitely a need to protect aid, and ACT Church of Sweden is participating in the broad civil society campaign to do so. And you will have the opportunity to sign the petition right here and now or later today. But even though the situation is urgent, we need to think proactively and long-term, and that's what we're going to do now. Aid is definitely needed more than ever, but is it fit for purpose? Is the present aid architecture capable of responding to the challenges that the world faces today? And I think we can all agree that development cooperation is far from perfect today. There are many unmet promises. The funding gaps are huge. And we also have the growing debate on decolonizing aid. And that's just a few examples. And global public investment, GPI, is an idea and an approach to transform foreign aid, as we see today, to go from a world of donors and recipients to a world of mutual cooperation, where all contribute, all benefit, and all have a seat at the table where the decisions are made. Could GPI be a way forward and help countries work more effectively together to solve the great challenges of our time? Finally, you may wonder about the red square on the screen you see there, and that represents 1% of the total screen, and that is the proportion of our national income in Sweden that we think should continue to go to be shared in the form of development aid. And before the national elections in September, 23 Swedish Christian churches and organizations have made a message that we have formed a message, and we're calling for 1/100th to the world. So I will now introduce our main speaker, Anton O'Field-Kerr. You're a member of the expert working group on global public investment and also director of Equal International, which is a leading international development consultancy whose mission is to ensure the inclusion and dignity of marginalized groups and those of risk of being left behind. You began your career as a nurse in South Africa, but now working on policy and international development. Specialist in policy and strategy development, and especially been working on HIV, health and human rights. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gunnel. And firstly, thank you to Church of Sweden for inviting me to come and present GPI to you. What I'm going to talk to you, as Gunnel said, is around this concept of global public investment, which is not only a call for existing aid, but actually a call for a radically increased volume of global public investment to meet the challenges that we face in the world in relation to climate, health and inequality. And before going into the detail of why global public investment, I want to explain why I would describe myself as a optimistic activist. Because what we're calling for is very big. But from my own personal experience, there's a few moments when I reflect that of why I'm so optimistic. Firstly, I was born in South Africa under apartheid with a family that was affected for more than 3 generations by apartheid. And growing up, I never would have imagined a world outside of apartheid, a different world. And in 1995, that came about. So as an example of an existing kind of paradigm that was hard to imagine that it would be different, but a huge amount of effort went in to make that happen. The next key moment that I think defined me as an optimistic activist was in the 1990s, 80s and 90s, we saw the HIV epidemic explode. At the time, I was a nurse in South Africa, and I returned to the UK and saw how the epidemic was going pretty much unnoticed. There were some really big structural things that stopped an effective response to HIV. One of those was the cost of medicines. So back then, Africa had to accept that prevention was the main solution, because the treatment for HIV cost 20,000 euros per person, and the average spend on health was around $18 per person. It took campaigning, and at the time around 300,000 people were receiving ARV treatment in a time when the HIV epidemic affected 42 million people, and millions of people were dying per year. Thanks to campaigns to people that fought for a better solution, we saw significant reduction in the cost of medicines, complete change in how intellectual property was looked at, and a paradigm shift, so that now we have over 18 million people on treatment, and a different kind of response to HIV. And the final, I think, for me, personal reason for a shift in my optimism is I grew up a gay man, not imagining that I could have a family. And again, in 2005 in the UK, we saw the introduction of civil partnership, which meant that overnight I could imagine having a family. And so those are just some personal reasons why, when presenting something as bold as global public investment, I'm driven by optimism. So firstly, the problem. Can you get a napkin for me? Because I sweat a lot. When I speak publicly, I can sweat a lot. So excuse me. So firstly, what's the problem? The problem that we're aiming to face through this solution is that international development and international investment in development, such as ODA, has some unique characteristics, which mean that concessional public finance is really important if we are going to address the big challenges of the world. These challenges can include what we've seen, for example, recently, the impact of COVID, health financing, the climate change, the challenge that we have in relation to biodiversity, gender inequality, the structure of aid. So the challenges that we face now are huge and require so much more public investment rather than decreased public investment. When it comes to what we call for in global public investment, essentially it's 5 paradigm shifts. So traditionally, aid, which was really born out of the Bretton Woods kind of framework, it's very much dependent on a structure where you have a few northern donors and many recipients. So when we look at that, that's a very in today's age we say that's a very old century, last century model, which is very patronizing, very colonial. Requires donors, requires recipients, and requires recipients to be passive recipients, i.e. they don't often get much say in the kind of aid that's provided. So when in GPI we call for a huge shift in ambition, from the narrow focus on reducing poverty or addressing short-term issues, to the broader challenges and addressing the broader challenges of inequality and sustainability. When it comes to function, often aid is seen as a means to address short-term problems and a quick fix, and that when the problem is solved, then you move on. The reality is the problem that we have today, and many of the problems are so endemic, they will take so long to change, that actually what we call for is long-term investment in key challenges and essentially long-term investments in addressing inequality. When it comes to geography, the other kind of big paradigm shift is, as I said, international aid for now, up until now, has been very much kind of a north and a south, a donor recipient. The challenge we have there is many countries are no longer low-income countries, they're middle-income countries, which means that in the aid narrative, they've graduated, so they're no longer eligible for aid. We saw this very concretely in countries like South Africa, Nigeria, China, India, where in 1 year a country could graduate to upper middle income country status and then become ineligible for aid. When the problems in those countries, whether it's addressing HIV, women's empowerment, gender inequality, didn't change in that year. And it shows that our model isn't really fit for purpose. When it comes to governance, many of our global kind of donor mechanisms are patronizing. They have donors that sit on the governance and decide where the money will go, and recipients that don't get to have a say. So anyone who's been involved in development will know that good policies require active engagement of those that are receiving those funds and being part of those programs. And then what we call for is a significant shift in the narrative to one where we have that donor-recipient relationship to one where there's mutual benefit, mutual accountability. So global public investment as an idea, and I'll tell you a bit later how we've been supporting this, can be boiled down to the very simple concept that for the future, for the significant amount of resources that we need to address global challenges, we need a system where all contribute according to means, so all countries contribute, all benefit according to need, and really important when it comes to the governance, all decide. And as I mentioned, in many of our mechanisms, that's just not the case. We at Equal International, we're a small consultancy that are very much focused on marginalization, but also on thought leadership. So this has been our vision, basically working towards a healthier, fairer, and more sustainable world anchored in international public finance, where all benefit, all decide, and all contribute. And our overall mission is to champion the co-creation of a technically feasible and a politically attractive proposition of global public investment through thought leadership and enabling implementation. And then our impact goal is that a post-2030 compact is informed by and committed to the principles of GPI, global public investment, for the for financing of the global challenges. So why GPI and why is it compelling? COVID has highlighted, up until COVID 2 years ago, the work that we've been doing on GPI, which has been going on for around 7 years now, a co-creation process, had been seen very much as an advocacy piece, as a critique, and not, as theoretical. COVID changed that. The moment COVID happened, we saw that the architecture that we have in place for addressing global challenges isn't fit for purpose. So you had countries like in Europe, in America, that required an effective response to COVID as much as developing countries did. But our financing systems, our way of responding really didn't exist to be able to support that. As well as COVID, we've seen that things like pledging rounds, so there's many funds for health, the Global Fund, Gavi, UNITAID. Under climate, there's a whole set of funds. Well, when you look at the replenishments that needed for each of these funds, there isn't enough money for them. And so simply, we need a huge amount more public investment if we're going to take seriously the challenges that we face now and that our future generations face. So really, ODA and global public investment we need to be in it for the long term. And then what we need is more and better funding. So more money to tackle the challenge that we face, a greater commitment by more countries to contribute, so not just donor countries who are struggling to keep to their 0.1, 0.7%. The argument of GPI is that all countries should contribute some of their GNI to public investment, and then better decision making. So what you find is many middle, low-income countries aren't interested in making contributions, because ultimately if they do, they don't have a seat at the table. So why would they? In the all contribute, as I mentioned, that we could have multiple sources of funding, from contributions from GNI to fresh international financing through threshold drawing rights, through GDP-backed bonds, through pledging rounds, and then global shared levies managed nationally. And then when it comes to all benefit, the key thing here is what we've identified as the key challenges that we need to face through global public investment is health, climate, and addressing inequalities. That's just kind of a big way of the kind of highlights a way of capturing the key issues that we need to face. This is just a little bit about the kind of pathway to impact. I'll say that in everything that we do at Equal, we use a theory of change approach. A theory of change approach just essentially says the first thing we have to do is to understand the problem that we're dealing with, understand the challenge that we're faced with. The second window in a theory of change is understanding a potential solution. And then the third window is making the politics happen. And through a co-creation process, we've been working in consultation with many partners in the Global South and North in first articulating the challenge with a traditional ODA, and also co-creating a concept or a vision for a new way of financing international challenges. And you'll see this diagram kind of explains the ever cycle of co-creation. And so a lot of what we've articulated through GPI has been assimilating what countries in the South, what partners in the South tell us and have been challenging in relation to the shortcomings of short-term aid. This is a little bit of the journey that we went through in that so far in that co-creation process, from defining the problem to multiple kind of dialogues and roundtables, very similar to this, to articulating, and I'll come on to a little while, through the help of an expert working group, the key principles of GPI. And just to say that a dialogue like this is really important to us because it's part of the co-creation process, it's part of getting feedback and honing and fine-tuning the proposition. And we convened almost 2 years ago an expert working group, of which I'm part, that brought people from different regions, different sectors together to work with us on better articulating what we mean by GPI, because it's a bold, radical vision, and those were some of the members. And then I'll very briefly, the expert working group members recommended that once they'd written a report on GPI, what it is, what it aims to achieve, that we undertake a global consultation, and that it should be a long consultation to gain insights and to do further outreach. This is just a quick snapshot of the kind of the places where we worked with partners to convene round tables to talk about GPI and how it could be a solution in the region or thematically. In the meetings, these were the many organizations that we worked with in different regions and also globally. And then from a consultation, which we spent around 6 months doing, and are just finalizing the final report of the expert working group, some of the key themes that I don't have time to go into detail, but essentially from Africa, from LAC, from Asia, were their response to GPI, but also the importance of GPI in tackling the big challenges such as climate, finance, and inequality. Examples of best practice. GPI doesn't come from nowhere, so we've got examples like the Global Fund, Social Protection Fund, recently the FIF. If you can look at the European Union in a way as a best practice in a GPI in the sharing of resources. Those were just some examples that we can go through in the conversation in a little bit more detail on how GPI doesn't come from nowhere, but it evolves out of many ideas. But that's a very quick summary of what GPI is and where we've got to in that journey. And then we've left some questions for to hand over to Gonal with.
Yes, and thank you so much, Anton. And I hope that you have listened, have got some of the excitement that I got when I first came across these ideas. And I'll now invite the rest of the panel. So please, Ulrika Medeer, and I'll start. Yeah, you can be there, and I'll start introduce you as you come. You're the UN Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP. And before joining UNDP, you were the State Secretary at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We knew you since that. And you were working with the Minister for Development Cooperation between 2014 and 2018. And earlier you were working in the NGO development sector here in Sweden. And you are Forsell, Member of Parliament, the Committee of Foreign Affairs, a spokesperson for development cooperation and international affairs in the Liberal Party. And you were also the president of the Liberal Party's youth organization earlier. And recently you have made yourself known as a strong defender of development cooperation, I would say. And finally, Erik Lysén, my director of ACT Church of Sweden, and also moderator or chairperson, you could say, of ACT Alliance, which is an alliance of more than 140 churches and faith-based development organizations working in 120 countries. So very much involved in global cooperation. Perhaps you could not hide our nice backdrop. But first, I turn to Ulrika. From hearing this maybe it's, yeah, thanks. From hearing the presentation and from your background in the global level, what's your spontaneous reactions to these ideas and proposals?
Well, I think it's a very welcome discussion and a great idea for the many reasons that you outlined in your presentation. So I'm very much looking forward to continue discussions as well, because these discussions are taking place and you are having discussions also with colleagues of mine in the United Nations. And of course, we more than most perhaps would understand the need to come together and actually do long-term investments. And throughout this week or these days in Almedalen here, we have in a number of panels here discussed the need to move from short-termism that is becoming more and more present also in the UN setting, where our organizations are also short-term funded through projects, while we are so aware of the need to actually do joint investments in global public goods, but also to address the crisis that you were referring to. And with United Nations Development Programme, we have also spoken about inequality as one of the key challenges, whether we speak about inequality between countries or within countries in different economies, also because it really threatens the social trust and the fabric of trust that really holds together the whole idea of moving countries into democracies and more participatory democracies. And climate change also, of course, being one of the challenges, alongside, of course, with the solution to preserve biodiversity and address the triple crisis that we face with regards to our planet, but also the many and increasingly protracted crises and conflicts that we see. All of these different trends affecting all populations across the world, and hence the need then to find a new way of financing with high qualitative finance that can address the challenges. I also agree on the problem with regards to the traditional aid model that is indeed paternalistic, and this is also discussions that we are having within the UN, but then perhaps going back to the UN as actually a possibility, an old institution, 75 years and counting, but still, I think, an institution where we try to find ways of bringing partnerships about. And just to say also, and I think it is important, because while ODA has been the only really stable financial flow, so it's great to see that there are defenders of this in the difficult times that countries are in right now. What we see within the UN, and that is certainly the case for United Nations Development Programme, is also an increased investment by the developing economies themselves. So more than 1/5 of UNDP's budget is actually also from both low but also middle-income countries. And the discussion, I think, that you also alluded to with regards to the need to look at, yes, the LDCs, but also the middle-income economies as part of the solution. And it goes without saying, of course, as we discuss climate change, that part of the solutions really lie also in climate finance for middle-income economies that can be key drivers of change with regards to both mitigation but also solutions for adaptation. So while we would be always concerned about the need to support LDCs, we also need to look at how different economies, different political economies evolve with inequality in mind, but also with, let's say, climate change is one very concrete example in mind, where some of the solutions actually are to be found in also countries that are not the ones receiving ODA as we construct it right now.
Okay, thank you. So some positive note there, I would say. Thank you. You are, from your view as a politician in the day-to-day affairs, what's your reaction? What opportunities and risks and hinders do you see for this kind of thinking?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for the presentation. It's great to be here. It was a great presentation. I think that I'm going to try to be as little party politician as I can, and try to have a broader perspective. I think that, I mean, it's always I think it's always good if we can have a discussion on aid that it's not around if we should have more or less aid, because I mean, that is important, of course, to defend aid, but it's a tiresome discussion when you can't focus on how can we have a better aid. And I think that talking about models like this one is a good way to do that, because it's a discussion that you can bring parties together around, whether they're like right-wing or left-wing economically. I think we can agree that it's good to have aid that is effective. It's good to have aid that achieves its goals. It's good to have a model for aid that is more modern, and I think that having long-term investments is a good way to be more effective than having short-term projects or and so on. I do think that there are of course a lot of examples of patronizing within the aid system and with the old model and so on. But there are also many examples of projects and organizations working with the aid and so on that are not patronizing, that has been developing not patronizing methods for many years. So I think this is as a tool, as a part of a toolbox, this model could be good. I think you should have. We have to look at it as a part of the bigger structure. I also think that. It might be better for some parts, some themes than others. From a Swedish perspective, it's very important to push for, to build democratic institutions. For example, it might be harder to do that with this model if you're because you often have to do that from grassroots level and not from because the way I understand this model, then the funding has to come from different countries, different governments, and also governments that might not like a democratic future. So it might be harder to use it in some themes and easier to use it in some other themes. And I think it should be used in an appropriate way in the right circumstances. But I think it's having these discussions might open doors to have a better debate on aid overall, because we're going away from the cut no cut additional aid discussion and going into like how should we do this in a very, very productive way, I think.
Thank you so much. And finally, Eric, what opportunities or ways forward do you see?
Well, I think it's very timely to have this conversation right now, because I think there is so much frustrations among global civil society organizations, but also governments from the global south in terms of the narrative, the aid narrative, that we have to move to a different point where we're talking about our common global challenges, as was referred to by Ulrika and Joar as well. So in that sense, it echoes very well the discussions we are having within the ACT Alliance. You referred to it, where we have more than 140 members from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and they really want to bring the issue of aid to the forefront and to discuss it in very critical terms. it's time to decolonize aid. You know, that's the theme, and we've been discussing that in the alliance, and we are being criticized as being European-based agencies, that we are not letting go of our power and our resources. And I think the GPI responds partly to that. There are definitely interesting to see how you link it up to the whole issue of decolonizing of aid, and also localization, meaning locally led initiatives by local communities and local organizations. And I think that's perhaps a challenge with this model. How should we link it? I think it's possible to do it, but it merits further discussions. Also, in terms of support from ACT Alliance members, I think generally there will be buy-in. But I agree with Joar, there are still some outstanding questions as to the political possibility of implementing such a model. We live in a world of autocracy today, where almost 70% of the world's population live in sort of under authoritarian regimes. So the whole issue of respect for human rights and democracy will come to the fore when you are discussing the GPI model as such. We know how difficult it has been within the European Union, for instance, with the Article 7 procedures that have been launched against Poland and Hungary. So I think that is something we need to continue to discuss.
Thank you. And Anton, what's your response on these ideas and questions?
So really welcome the enthusiasm around the idea. I think the point that you've picked up on, which is around almost like the politics and the governance, is key. Because really GPI is about shifting power and shifting decision makers to people who will be most affected, the kind of beneficiaries of funding. And I think I use reference to models that exist, like the European Union, but also having worked so much for and with the Global Fund, we have a model there which really already implements lots of GPI principles. So, for example, the governance of the Global Fund, which is a fund that was created to address HIV, TB, and malaria, has 22 board seats, not just of donors. Donors only have about a third of the board seats. Implementers have board seats, but also really importantly, communities and NGOs from North and South have a seat on the board. And what we've seen is that really impacts the detail and nuance of policies that are developed by the Global Fund. And then also importantly, the Global Fund is a fund that funds countries rather than governments. Now that's quite unusual, because many funds are set up to fund governments. When you fund a country, it means that the Global Fund has to have a CCM, a country coordinating mechanism, which actually makes the application. And a CCM has basically lots of different sectors, including community, sitting on the CCM. So I mention that because the idea of shifting governance to decision making and the nuance of applying, say, human rights principles in programming has been grappled with institutions like the Global Fund. Not all it doesn't go always well, but it does demonstrate that it's much harder work because you have to have consensus, but that there's models there that show us that it is possible.
Thank you. I'll go back to you now, Ulrika. In the multilateral system where you sit, you mentioned earlier that the middle-income countries and low-income countries perhaps also are contributing more already, so you can see part of this happening. In what way could you, as a UN organization, promote this development, and what are the most important steps you think to be taken?
Well, I think, and I alluded to that earlier, that one of the problems right now is that we are moving in the wrong direction with regards to the time scenarios that we should deal with. And we have seen that and also discussed throughout these past days that when politicians across the traditional donor countries defend ODA, they find it so much easier to defend humanitarian aid, while we see the need then, based on science and everything we know also from practice, to address these global challenges that you gave as an example, and I would then add the many increasingly protracted crises and conflicts that we see. And we would also know, and the UN and UNDP together with the World Bank did a study not too many years ago called Pathways for Peace, that one krona of investment in prevention actually yields then 16 kroners with regards to saving if we look at effective aid. So I think one of the things that is really important with regards to this is the discussion that we need to have right here and right now with regards to the need to actually discuss both prevention and long-term challenges and solutions. And of course, then turning the discussion somewhat around with regards to co-investment. And that's why I also wanted to share that this is actually happening within the UN scene right now. In the Swedish debate, I think many times it would be like, we are sending all this money through the UN funds and programs, while if you look at our budgets, and they are also then owned by the member states through the boards, it looks very different than I believe most people in the traditional donor countries would think. And then, of course, what we also do, because ODA and the possibility to then mobilize the funding, as you also spoke to, I believe will be very key, but it would not most likely be possible through taxpayers' funding. So we then have to also really look at the financing for development agenda and how we can leverage also private finance through, if we call it ODA or if we have a new concept. But public funds needs to leverage then private finance. And the global wealth right now is $472 trillion. I mean, this is not and should not be a problem. And we have, as UNDP, promised that we would want to leverage throughout our strategic plan period of 4 years, 1 trillion, through our new ways of working with regards to leveraging private finance and looking at how we can have, for instance, SDG-aligned impact investments through big investment firms, where we have developed an instrument. That's just one of the examples that we have in our impact investment agenda.
Okay, thank you. I turn to you, Joar. As you know, I'm not sure about your party, but I know at least 2 other parties in the Swedish Parliament who has stated that they have a zero vision of development of ODA, that they would like to see the phasing out of ODA. And one party is saying, well, in 2030, when the Agenda 2030 is fulfilled, there will be no more need. Quite unrealistic, we would say. But would you imagine to interpret this vision not as an expression of a will for Sweden to turn its back on the rest of the world, or could it be seen as an expression of frustration with the current model and seeing something different? Or do you think that would you imagine a readiness to continue to contribute to the global cooperation in perhaps even larger way, but in a way where we as a country more explicitly also benefit from it?
Sure, I think that if you we don't have that, we don't say that in the same way. And but I think if you would ask those parties, they would probably say that. I mean, the goal is that there should be no need for aid, and that's why they have a. I mean, that would be the argument. Yeah, of course, and everyone wishes for that. So it's sort of a. I mean, why would you say it if everyone wishes for it anyways? But okay, but I think that sure, I think that's sort of to the point that I was trying to make before as well. I mean, that this is like if we can talk about aid in new ways and try to find new models and try to find ways to have a debate around aid that is not about how much aid we should have, but more about what aid should look like. Then I think it could be a way to engage those parties as well. It could also be a way to sort of break the ice in the aid debate within the parties as well. I think because there are, of course, I mean, politicians and people within every party that are like stuck in their ideas stuck in their political positions as well. But I also think that, I mean, to add to that, there is an ongoing debate in Sweden and of course in other countries as well that, I mean, Agenda 2030 it's a good thing, but it's not enough. And of course it is a compromise between countries, between democracies and autocracies, for example. And we need to. I think that from a Swedish perspective, most parties agree that we need to have more focus on democracy than Agenda 2030 2030 actually has. It doesn't mean that we don't need to work for Agenda 2030, because it's a great tool. It's a great tool to get all society together. It's a great tool to get companies and aid organizations and the UN and all those actors to work together. But we also need to work with the not only MR principles, but actual democracy in the sense that you vote for your leaders and you choose them, and you follow up and you toss them out and all of that. So I think that no matter if we achieve all the goals in the Agenda 2030 or not, we will still have a lot of things that we need to work with as a democratic country in the world.
Thanks. And Eric, you were mentioning earlier that within the ACT Alliance, you very concretely face the challenges of the aid architecture, but also try to practice GPI, I would say. What are the main, from that experience, what are the main issues forward, and what would you like perhaps the Swedish politicians to take forward?
Well, first of all, I can just sort of reflect a little bit on the model that we have for financing the ACT Alliance. Every member, these 140 members from around the world, they pay membership fees, but then they also pay income-based fees in relation to your own revenues and incomes as an organization. So some of the richer members pay proportionately more. So that's sort of a GPI model on that small scale for the ACT Alliance. I mean, we're not so small, but still. And it works quite well, because then you get something in return. All the members do that. We do undertake joint advocacy. We have capacity sharing initiatives in various different fields. So it makes us strong as an alliance. And so in that sense, I think there are also the possibility of GPI becoming, especially the principles. These are the principles that we can always advocate whenever we undertake advocacy on climate change, responding to the COVID pandemic, but also on social and economic inequalities that are high on the list of priorities for most of the ACT Alliance members. I still think, as Joa pointed out, that the key political question will be then for some of the richer countries, the OECD DAC countries, to let go of their control of this initiative, also with regard to the issues of democracy and human rights, and given the trends and tendencies that we see around the world. So that's really the area where we need to engage our own politicians and then discuss whether we can overcome some of these obstacles and some of their objections to this model because of that.
Yeah.
One question from my side, but also perhaps to comment on this, I would really like to invite you to look closer into SDG 16, because I do think, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights compared early on the SDGs also to the Human Rights Convention and saw that there is a lot of potential. So while I would agree, and you're right, that democracy is sometimes a contested word among member states in the United Nations, or the states of our world, there are a lot of potential, I think, in the SDGs, because it is a holistic agenda and it brings together a number of challenges that countries are facing. And you can actually, and that's what UNDP does all the time, because we have a mandate to work on democratic governance, rule of law and human rights. We can show that this is many times the most effective way to bring development about. But also to comment, in the UN, we also have assessed contributions. But every time we try to bring up, for the good reasons that we know, and you also presented, the idea that we would actually increase the assessed contributions, it's a no-go. So it will, of course, be a difficult discussion, but yet I think so important. And one of the reasons, and I was curious, just on the generational approach to this, I believe young people would be much more interested to discuss this than they are with regards to the discussion on traditional ODA.
Yeah. And thank you. And 1 minute to Anton as a final word.
How to summarize all of that. I think what's really important is the energy. What we found, the enthusiasm around GPI, is there's lots of articulation of the problem, but very few articulations of a way going forward. And that's why we find there's lots of energy around GPI, because of how broadly applicable it is, from large to small, from north to south. So what I'd really like to do is to encourage the conversation to continue, and to an open call to engage with us as we carry on co-creating this idea.
Thank you so much. And I see hands rising, and you are all welcome to the tent behind. We will continue discussion, those who want to. afterwards. So thank you so much for everybody online.